Welcome dear chess friends, this is the last video of our course and we speak about the sidelines for white, which are not very popular, but of course better to know them. First of all, the move f4. Okay, after f4, f4 is positionally tricky move, yeah, sometimes. And also because our bishop can still be developed, yeah. On g4, on f5, if we would have already played d6, f4 would have higher value, of course. The main problem of this move is also that it loses a tempo, yeah? So positional problem that the bishop can go to f5 to g4 in more favorable circumstances, and also that we have an extra tempo, yeah? And here we can take on d4. Of course, white would like to recapture with the knight, but we are in time to play bishop g4, that's the key idea. Probably for white the only move to maintain the equality is knight d2 with the idea h3, bishop f3, knight takes f3. We can play e6, h3, we can take, use, okay, we will lose the pawn on d4, but we can use it for another tempo. We can play bishop before check, so no c3. After white plays bishop d2, we can take, queen d2 and knight e7 just. Knight c6 next, no problem of course. So this is the first sideline. Of course f4 is not dangerous sideline for us to face. If white plays bishop b5 check, this only helps us. We can play bishop d7, bishop takes d7, queen takes d7. Now, if white plays knight f3, we can take and play e6. Let's say this is typical development, knight c6, we can take with the b pawn, then knight e7, knight g6, bishop e7, castle. Of course, no problem for black. If white tries to consolidate the d4 pawn with c3, we can play e6. This is an advanced French. You can say me, okay, I don't play French, but okay, here you don't have the light square bishops. Of course, in the French, the main problem is bishop on c8. If white plays bishop b5 check, okay, we can do something, I guess. Knight f3, knight c6, castle. Now, okay, important moment, because don't play knight e7, dc5 is, okay, quite obvious. Just take on d4, knight e7, knight f5. Bishop e7, castle next, no problem. Important concept, if white plays g4, we can play knight e7, and then we can play with h5, g4 is weakening white's king, and then we can play with the long castle, yeah? So bishop b5 also quite harmless move. Knight c3. Okay, this move is interesting, as you know, against bishop f5, knight c3 is more or less, no, not more or less, it's a serious line, of course, yeah? But after c5 is not such a serious line, knight on c3 is not always well placed. Of course, white develops too early the knight on c3. But there are 125 games, mostly played online, and I was trying to understand why white plays knight c3 sometimes. And my explanation is that it's a pre-move. In some online games, white expects bishop f5 and pre-moves knight c3. So he then, after the pre-move knight c3 here, he needs to play the knight c3 line with against c5, yeah, which is not good, of course. So I think it's a pre-move. That's why you see a lot of games. That's my explanation. Now you have two good options. You can play knight c6, you can play e6. This is just good French because knight on c3 is misplaced. Good advanced French. Or you can play knight c6. Because if knight f3, now bishop g4. If bishop b5, you can take and play e6, knight e7, a6 next. No problem, of course. Here, actually, here I don't think that white equalizes, yeah? Or dc5, this is probably the only serious move. That's why maybe you can consider to play e6, but also dc5 is not dangerous. We play e6, take. And now we can play in a very effective way, we can play f6. Okay, we have already seen these ideas in the previous chapters, of course, many times. Queen e2, we can just take, knight f6. Castle, bishop d6 next. Knight on c3 is a problem, yeah? So, bishop e5, just king f7. We already know that this is not an issue. Then rook f8, king g8 whenever we want, yeah? So, okay. Bishop e3 also strange move from positional perspective because we can just take. Okay, white takes with the bishop, but I don't think that the bishop is very well placed on d4. We can play e6, knight h6, knight f5. Just initiative for black already. Probably the only interesting sideline is knight e2. And now we can play knight c6, c3. Of course you can play somehow, but bishop f5 is the most common continuation, but this is actually not so good. After dc5, knight ac5, white can play knight g3, and I think white is slightly better here. So don't play bishop f5. but we can play e6. Okay, we are playing again a French, yes, but white has a misplaced knight on e2. The knight in advanced French stays on f3, of course, yeah? If white is ready to pay such a high price to achieve a French position, I think we should be more than happy to go for it. Because knight on e2 is clearly misplaced. Knight on f3 much... Okay, if white would have knight on f3 now, it would be a French with tempo up for white, because we lost a tempo c6, c5. But with the knight on e2, okay, we have tempo down, but white has a knight on e2. It's a big issue. For example, if bishop e3, just play queen b6, queen d2, f6, already better for black. If a3, we use the typical idea f6, also better for black. If knight d2 with the idea knight f3, just take and f6 again. You see this knight on e2, we have always f6 plan, yeah, it's quite good for us. Knight f3, just take, bishop, queen c7, yeah. Then maybe bishop b4 or bishop c5, knight g7, castle. Of course, no problem for black. Probably the only playable option is g3 for white. Okay, because white has a knight on f2, so white needs to finish the development. And now I don't recommend to play f6, but I recommend to play cd4, cd4, f6. Why? Because if we start with f6, e6, queen f6, bishop g2, now if we develop knight e7, knight f5, white can take on c5. And if we play cd4 now white might recapture with the knight, yeah? And that's slightly better for white, probably. That's why we take on d4 mainly to avoid the option of knight takes d4, yeah? Because here knight takes d4 is an option. So better to take now, because now no knight takes d4, of course, e5 is hanging. If cd4, we just play f6, and it's a better version. If e6, queen f6, just knight g7, knight f5 next. Black is slightly better, of course. f4, just bishop e7, knight h6, castle next. When white has a pawn on f4, knight h6 becomes very good square, yeah, because now bishop h6. Bishop h3 is the engine's first move. We can take. And now knight e5, not bad move, but white has full compensation. I don't want to make a harmless line. I don't want to transform a harmless line into an interesting line for white, yeah? So I don't want to take on e5. I want to play bishop b4 check, take, queen d2 mistake because knight e5, knight f3 check, knight d2 better option. And now I take on e5, castle, knight f6. Now white can equalize, but not more. White should equalize with only moves. Knight f4, rook e1, queen e2. Of course, attacking e5. Once we move, white can take on e6. But we can take queen b6. And after something very logical like this, we reach a position that is absolutely equal. So what can we conclude? We can conclude that if white doesn't play here knight f3, if white doesn't play dc5, or if white doesn't play c3, these three main options, then black immediately achieves a fantastic position, sometimes even slightly better, with the only exception probably of this g3 line. But here white needs also to play bishop h3, white needs to sacrifice the pawn on e5. So, okay, if white is playing knight e2 just to equalize like this, okay, good luck, yeah? So that's it about this chapter. It was a very nice journey. We have seen a lot of interesting lines here. Also, a lot of video lessons were made by me and Alexei, as you know, together. And we had the option to, we had the chance to speak with each other, to focus on the important things, on the, not only on the moves, but also on some strategic ideas, of course. I think this was a very useful course, not only for the opening, but also for understanding of this kind of hybrid French Caro-Kann positions, yeah? Actually, we can call c5 a hybrid between French and Caro-Kann. Not just Caro-Kann, but it's a hybrid between French and Caro-Kann somehow. Thank you a lot for your attention. It was a nice journey. I hope that you will score a lot of nice points with the c5 move against e5, which is probably, 3-5 is probably white's most ambitious choice against the Caro-Kann, the most critical one for sure. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Bye.